Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of Swallow the Stars. This will be part 24, chapter 24, entitled Secrets Shared and Kept. Izuku opens his eyes and is, before everything else, extremely confused about the bright white ceiling lights and the deafening absence of his alarm clock. Is he late for school? Did Aizawa not check to see if he woke up, or, perhaps more likely, did Aizawa leave him asleep to teach him a lesson? Fuck, he's never going to forget to set his alarm ever again. But then he remembers that the lights in his bedroom aren't bright or white and are, instead, a soft amber, and there's no way to place the beeping sounds of nearby machinery within the walls of the room he keeps his collectibles and his clothes and his painting from Hitoshi. So it takes only seconds to jump past the incorrect conclusion that he's overslept, and a few more unpleasant seconds to push down the memories of the facility that threatened to drown him, before his brain finally catches up with his currently very limited sensory input. The gun, the blood, the pain, the hostages, the villain he had slammed into the ground without ever taking his gloves off. Carefully, he curls his fingers and then his toes, and he sits pleasantly, for a moment, in the movement and the feeling of his skin against warm sheets. When he swallows, his throat is stiff and a little dry but not painful, and he wonders what sort of quirk the doctor must have used to be able to close up a bullet wound in such a delicate area without any lasting pain. Or maybe Izuku's just on a lot of drugs. That seems like a reasonable assumption, too. Feeling lonely and a bit desperate, Izuku slowly turns his head to the left, away from the sounds of whatever machines are monitoring him. There's no one in the room, which digs a dull hurt behind his ribs until he notices the gray scarf-like capture weapon pulled on the plastic chair beside the bed. Aizawa's here, somewhere. It's a fact that settles over Izuku like cool water in a stream, and he has a sudden urge to cry. The door opens before the first tear falls, and Aizawa walks in, framed by the light of the hall and holding a white, recyclable cup of what must be coffee. Halfway through his first step, Aizawa's whole body tenses, and Izuku lifts his eyes to take in Aizawa's expression. He's prepared for shock and anger, maybe disappointment as well, but all he sees is overwhelming relief. Izuku opens his mouth in an attempt to say something. He hasn't thought far enough ahead yet to figure out exactly which words he wants to use. Maybe starting with a sorry would be good. But Aizawa beats him to it. He crosses the space between them quickly, putting his cup down on a table off to the side before bending over Izuku's bed and resting his forehead against Izuku's chest. Carefully, Izuku raises his hands, setting one on Aizawa's shoulder and the other on the back of his head, fingers tangling in long dark hair. It's as close to a hug as they're going to get until Izuku is vertical. Izuku. Aizawa sounds like he's been crying, like he might be crying right now. I'm sorry, Izuku says, and that, speaking, finally pulls something in his throat, causing a shiver of pain that hadn't been present when he'd simply swallowed. It hurts like fire and sandpaper, and he sounds worse than Coco ever has, but at least he can speak. I'm sorry for worrying you. Guilt stings him. If he'd just stayed hidden away, then he wouldn't have been shot, and his dad wouldn't have been scared or worried. Wouldn't have received a phone call from a stranger saying Izuku had just gotten injured in a villain attack. But that little girl would have been in his place, so maybe the guilt isn't about putting Aizawa through this. It's for not regretting the decisions that led him to this point. He has no idea how long they stay like this, but Izuku doesn't mind at all. He pushes his fingers through Aizawa's hair, a comfort to both of them, and lets the tears fall from his eyes unimpeded. Aizawa does sit up eventually, but even then he stays close, moving the plastic chair right up to the edge of the bed and taking Izuku's hand between both of his own. Does it hurt? Aizawa asks. There's still evidence of tears in his eyes, but his voice is steady. It's nothing short of astonishing in Izuku's opinion that Aizawa can be so calm right now. His dad is a rock, a solid pillar of support, and Izuku loves him for it. There's no use lying to him. A bit, Izuku admits. When I talk. He reaches up to touch the side of his throat, and he's surprised to find no bandages or stitches or anything. His throat is whole except for the line of a scar tissue that he attempts to ignore, with the same fervor that he ignores the tug of a needle in his arm and the shift of a tube against his skin. He doesn't necessarily succeed. Like something's pulling. Okay, don't strain yourself too much. You're really damn lucky that the shot was only grazing. That explains a lot, actually. The thinness of the scar, the fact that he can still talk, the way he's alive and didn't bleed out on the way to the hospital, and it fits with his memories, too. The gun flushed to the side of his neck, but pulled away by whatever was thrown out from one of the first responders. A few millimeters, and Izuku could have lost his voice. A few more, and he could have lost his life. But as it is, He just has a new scar and some new nightmare material. Aizawa checks his phone quickly, like he's looking at the time. Hisashi will be back soon. He went to pick up Shinso. Izuku's chest fills with warmth, both at the casual assurance that Hisashi had been there already, and had only left to go pick up Izuku's best friend. Boyfriend? They should really have a conversation about labeling. The police want a statement, as soon as you're able, but if it hurts too much to talk, we can make them wait. Izuku shakes his head, minute little movements to keep from pulling on his neck, even though it seems to be at least mostly healed. I'll be fine. Wait. He's in the hospital. Someone used a healing quirk on him. They had administered medication and maybe even taken him to surgery, depending on the ability of the healing quirk. His eyes widen as something like panic slips into his bloodstream. Dad, the doctors, do they know? It's not easy to tell a quirkless person apart from people with quirks, not on the surface. There's an extra toe joint, but that's covered up by shoes. Medically, however, there are differences, and Izuku knows this far too well from his time in the facility. To be here in the hospital, to have been under the eye of a doctor, even if he hasn't used Amahaki on the villain. Aizawa leans forward as soon as Izuku's breathing starts to escalate, one of the machines beeping a more frantic pace than before. Izuku, hey, breathe with me. It's okay. I talked to the doctor assigned to you already. It's all right. Just breathe, Izuku. Aizawa takes one of Izuku's hands and places it over his chest to demonstrate the pace of his breathing, puts his own hand on Izuku's chest to ground him. Izuku struggles to match it, curling his fingers into Aizawa's shirt until he's practically clinging for dear life. He feels like he's 12 again, fresh out of the facility with no idea how to regulate his emotions other than to squash them before they start, or be blindsided when he can't, and then sedated through them. He gasps for air and shakes so hard that he has to wonder if he's going to bite his tongue, if he's going to taste blood in his throat again so soon. But then Aizawa's closer, on the bed now, and Izuku finds himself being pulled firmly into his chest. He hasn't been held like this in a while, wrapped in strong arms, willing to defend him against the entire world if needed. And Izuku finally breaks. All the adrenaline from the villain attack, all the pain from being shot, all the fear he'd felt, in the moments after slamming the villain into the ground that maybe he'd just killed another person and maybe his dads won't be able to forgive him this time. It all floods out of him in gut-wrenching sobs. They must stay like that for several minutes. By the end of it, Izuku wants nothing more than to go to sleep, exhaustion heavy in his bones, but he wants to see Hisashi and Hitoshi, and he wants to get the police questioning over with so that he doesn't have to deal with it tomorrow. Izuku doesn't pull away when his tears finally stop, and neither does Aizawa. There's a hand on his back, gently rubbing circles along his spine, and Aizawa's chin is resting on top of Izuku's head. The surgery team, Aizawa says, was read in on your situation after your surgery was done. Only the minimum amount of information was given. The decimation of the research labs made national news after Nezu had started tearing into them, so I told the surgeon and his nurses and assistants that you were rescued from there. The hand on his back never stops moving, and Aizawa's other hand comes up to cup the back of Izuku's head. It's all doctor-patient confidentiality, and thankfully, this is the hospital that Hisashi and I go to. So, we've assigned that surgeon and the doctor that used her quirk on you after to be your primary healthcare providers. Slowly, Izuku nods. If Aizawa is letting them be his doctors, then they know about his biologically quirkless status, and they are working around it. They probably don't even know about Amahaki. It's not like Izuku consciously used the god's power during the villain attack. He does wonder briefly if Amahaki is unable to come out of him if he's asleep, because there's no way his gloves were allowed to stay on during the surgery, but he decides that's a question he can figure out later. Especially when the door opens to admit a rather somber-looking Hisashi with a distraught-looking Hitoshi in his wake. Izuku's the first to pull away from Aizawa, hands coming up to wipe at his cheeks, and he only now registers the bandages in place over his palms, wrapped tightly from his wrist to his knuckles. "Hi, Dad," Izuku murmurs, reaching out a hand toward Hisashi. Immediately, a smile blooms over Hisashi's face, and he rushes forward. Aizawa steps away from the bed just as Hisashi moves in to take his place. Despite his usual levels of energy and unusual but very evident levels of anxiety, Hisashi is impressively gentle when he gathers Izuku into his arms and presses a dozen kisses to the top of his head. Izuku brings his arms up and rests his hands on Hisashi's back. "I'm all right," he promises, though it might be a lie given that his throat hurts and this whole thing will probably give him nightmares for a while. "I'm all right. I'm sorry for worrying you." Hisashi pulls away, and his hands immediately move to cup Izuku's cheeks, thumbs brushing away Izuku's tears. No, hey, none of that now. His eyes flick down to Izuku's throat, to the scar he knows is there. but he doesn't say anything about it before his gaze moves back up to Izuku's face. I'm just really glad you're okay. Izuku. Heart dropping into his stomach, Izuku follows that broken voice to Hitoshi, who is still just barely inside of the room. His hands are clasped together and wringing themselves out, anxious and, Izuku knows from personal experience, painful. Izuku leans away from Hisashi immediately, and the only thing that stops him from getting out of bed is that he knows he'd never be allowed to. Don't do that, Izuku says gently, both hands out and making grabby motions toward Hitoshi. He doesn't care if it's childish, especially because it works. Hitoshi crosses the room slowly, and there are tears welling in his eyes, but not falling. He looks haunted. Hitoshi, don't blame yourself. As soon as he's within reach, Hitoshi grabs both of Izuku's hands. It's tight, bone-crushing, but Izuku's glad for it. I should have gone with you. Izuku shakes his head, making sure to catch Hitoshi's gaze when he does. No, I mean it. Then you would have just been hurt too. When Hitoshi doesn't immediately say anything, Izuku tugs at his hands. He doesn't care that his dads are in the room. Doesn't really care if they already know, or if this is going to be the first time they find out just how close Izuku and Hitoshi have grown since the kidnapping. Come here, he says, pulling Hitoshi ever closer to him. With a stumbled step, and lacking the confidence Izuku has come to recognize and admire in him, Hitoshi climbs onto the bed. Izuku doesn't hesitate in immediately wrapping his arms around him and pulling him in so that they're both laying down. It's probably not healthy how quickly Izuku can cast aside his own fears and doubts and panic in the face of someone else's, but Aizawa does the same thing, so it can't be too bad. If, Hitoshi starts, face hidden against Izuku's chest. If I had been there, I could have stopped it. Izuku moves his gaze to Aizawa and Hisashi, the former back to sitting in the chair and the latter standing to the side with his hand on Aizawa's shoulder. Neither of them look surprised, just worried. Hisashi looks like he wants to say something, but Izuku thinks that Hitoshi doesn't need gentle reassurances from Izuku's dad. He needs something a little more normal, probably. So Izuku huffs, a sound he often makes when he rolls his eyes. You don't know that. You weren't even there. Izuku is aware, however, that Hitoshi is technically correct. The villain had been talkative, and Hitoshi's quirk would have ended things before they started. If, of course, he could have held control for long enough, which is definitely not a guarantee. Besides, he says, not willing at all to share with Hitoshi that he could have potentially mitigated a situation that ended with Izuku injured. We've already gotten one big lecture about illegal quirk usage, and I really don't want another for as long as I live. Thanks. His throat hurts from talking, but he thinks it's worth it when Hitoshi hiccups a laugh and tightens his arms around Izuku's middle. Izuku's fingers slowly find their way into Hitoshi's hair, playing with it like he does when they're in Izuku's room and settling down after a couple of hours of homework. It's okay, Hitoshi. I'm okay, he promises, quiet and gentle, and he's not surprised that he actually means it. Of all the things that have happened to him, being held hostage by a villain isn't so bad, and the new scar on his throat is just one among many. This is what he tells himself, at least, and he'll do so until the thought becomes reality. You better be. There's still a ring of stress around Hitoshi's voice, but he sounds much more like himself now. Izuku laughs, or tries to, but his throat collapses a bit and he breaks into a series of coughs. Hitoshi jerks up onto his hip, concerned, but Izuku keeps his grip on his hand, so that he can't fully leave. Hisashi walks into view, then holding out a cup of water to help Izuku drink. It's cool on his throat and relieves some of the pulling sensation. Thank you. Hisashi ruffles his hair. Of course. Better? Izuku nods and then settles back against the bed. Eventually, probably more than 30 minutes later, there's a knock at the door and Detective Tsukuchi walks in. Izuku smiles at him, teasing and almost giddy when he gets a sigh and a dramatic groan in return. Aizawa's right, Tsukuchi says, watching while the bed is tilted up by Hisashi so that Izuku is in more of a sitting position. Izuku keeps a firm hold onto Hitoshi, who is back to using him as a pillow so that he doesn't even think about leaving. You really are a problem, child. Izuku sticks out his tongue playfully, which earns him a laugh from Hisashi and a soft smile from Aizawa. Don't lie. I'm your favorite reason for paperwork. Kid, there is no good reason for paperwork. Still, Tsukuchi-san approaches the bed and starts to set up. Aizawa vacates his chair, offering it to the detective. All right, Tsukuchi-san says once he's settled in. You know the drill by now. I'm going to record this and use my quirk to announce verbally if you're telling the truth. When Izuku nods to show he understands, really, they do have to stop meeting like this. The dinners at Hisashi's apartment are so much nicer. Tsukuchi-san starts the questioning. As he talks through what happened, Izuku keeps a close eye on both of his dads. It's immediately clear that neither of them are thrilled about him trading places with the little girl, but he can tell from their expressions that it's more resigned understanding than outright disapproval. Which is good, because Izuku will defend that decision until the day he dies. "What happened after the villain traded the girl for you?" Tsukuchi-san asks, looking up from where he's annotating in a small notebook. Izuku tightens his arm around Hitoshi and receives a small, lilted sound of concern from him. To soothe Hitoshi's worry, Izuku relaxes, again quickly, and swipes his thumb along Hitoshi's arm. Nothing happened for a while. The villain was waiting for a call back from the police, but the door got busted down instead. He recounts with as little detail as possible for his own sanity the 2 people bursting into the shop and the attack on the villain. When he glances at Aizawa and Hisashi again, they look just this side of furious, like they're trying to rein it in for Izuku's sake. Tsukuchi-san doesn't look much happier, especially when his quirk confirms that Izuku's story is truthful. "Okay, Izuku, last question. The responding hero and police officer, as well as the other hostages, confirm that you were the one who took down the villain." "Is he—" Izuku can't finish the question. "He's alive," Tsukuchi-san assures. "I just want to ask, knowing the nature of your quirk, if you used it all during the scenario." Izuku shakes his head rapidly back and forth. No, I can't use my quirk if my gloves are on. And I left them on the whole time. I just, when I got shot, my training kicked in, I guess. I just grabbed him and slammed him into the ground. I didn't mean to hurt him." He feels Hitoshi tracing careful circles into his side, and the gentle reassurance allows Izuku to breathe. It's not entirely the truth, but because he doesn't understand what really happened, it's close enough. "It's all right. No one's blaming you for that. You acted in self-defense, and you didn't do anything until after you were already in what was, unfortunately, mortal danger." With a soft sigh, Tsukuchi-san clicks off the audio recorder and leans back in his chair to scrub his face. Izuku's throat is in active and distracting discomfort by now. Thankfully, Hisashi, who is just as well versed in Izuku's many emotions and expressions as Aizawa is, notices quickly and moves to refill his cup with water and help him drink it. "Who was the responding hero?" Aizawa asks, the question clearly directed at Tsukuchi-san, although Izuku can't see to confirm. What with Hisashi blocking his view, Aizawa sounds pissed. There's a shuffle of papers, and then Tsukuchi-san answers. It was a sidekick, Rope Burn." "Are you investigating his and that officer's actions?" Aizawa's voice is completely cold, and Izuku nearly chokes on the water he's trying to swallow. "Well, I'm sure as fuck going to now." Tsukuchi-san is doing a slightly better job at disguising his temper. Slightly. He rises to his feet, taking one last look at Izuku on the bed with Hitoshi still curled up against him before turning toward the door. "I'll keep you all in the loop, and I'll reach out if I have any further questions, though I shouldn't." He pauses at the door, and despite his evident distaste at the whole situation, he smiles at Izuku. "I'm glad you're okay, kid." As soon as Tsukuchi-san is gone, Aizawa pushes out a heavy breath. It's clear to Izuku that he's still angry, and Izuku thinks it's best to leave him be for the moment. Instead, he cards his fingers through Hitoshi's hair again, soothing himself with the familiar motion and texture. "I'm going to give that fucking sidekick a piece of my mind tomorrow," Aizawa says suddenly. "And you are not going to stop me, Hisashi." "Stop you?" When Izuku lifts his eyes, he finds Hisashi looking nearly as angry as Aizawa. "Shota, I'm going to join you." Izuku decides not to say anything. It no longer catches him off balance when his dads do something like this, something that shows how deeply they care. And besides that, Izuku firmly believes that what happened at the shop was not his fault, that the situation never would have escalated as far as it had if the police officers and sidekicks had handled it better. So he lets Aizawa and Hisashi glare at nothing for a while before he sighs quietly to redirect their attention and energy. "Can I go home tonight?" Aizawa pushes his hand through his hair, and that seems to act as a mental reset more than anything because while his bangs immediately fall back over his eyes, he's much more collected when he meets Izuku's gaze. "That depends. How are you feeling? Answer honestly, or I'm taking Shinso home right now." "Not if I can help it, old man." Hitoshi grumbles, arms tightening further around Izuku's waist. Izuku giggles into Hitoshi's hair, hiding his blush behind purple locks before looking up at Aizawa again. "Aside from my throat, I feel fine. And even that is like..." He makes a face. "It doesn't really hurt. It just feels like something stuck down there. Or like there are stitches inside that pull if I talk for too long, even though there aren't." His face falls for a moment, and he looks down at Hitoshi to escape his dad's searching gazes. "And I don't want to be left alone here. It's too similar." He can't say to the facility out loud, but he thinks it comes across anyway. Aizawa stares at him for a long moment, hardly blinking, like he's trying to pull a lie from Izuku's words, but not finding himself able to. Finally, he sighs. Yeah, I can go get the forms. It's going to be against medical advisement, but they can't force you to. The door rolls open, and immediately Aizawa stops talking, his whole body tensing. Which just makes Izuku tense in turn. It's late. The doctors and nurses aren't needed and weren't called. Tsukuchi-san just left. No one should be visiting them right now. Izuku looks past his dad to the door, and he's the first to see who's standing there. It's a tall blonde man with a slight hunch in his shoulders and sunken eyes, awkwardly clasping his hands in the frame of the doorway. Recognition bleeds through Izuku's brain. "Oh, you were one of the hostages at the shop. Are you okay?" he asks, pushing himself up straighter against the pillows. Hitoshi moves with him, unwilling to let go, it seems, but he still turns over enough to look at the man who entered. Both Hisashi and Aizawa have turned around by now, and Izuku notices how stiff their postures get, out of the corner of his eye. The man at the door startles, blinks, and then lets out a huff of nervous laughter, while his hand comes up to cup the back of his head. Yes, I'm all right. Thank you for asking." "Yagi-san," Aizawa says, biting off the honorific. Anger spills off of him, though Izuku doubts an untrained eye could see it. "You were there." Oh, that's his really dangerous voice. The one Izuku has never had directed at him, and he really hopes to keep it that way. For the first time since Izuku had pulled him into the bed, Hitoshi sits up straight and turns away from Izuku. The hand he places on Izuku's chest is clearly protective, and the tension in his shoulders is noticeable, but Izuku doubts that Hitoshi recognizes the blonde man, Yagi-san apparently, but Aizawa's voice and Hisashi's posturing makes it pretty undeniable that his presence isn't welcome. "Aizawa-san?" Yagi-san greets, still sheepish but clearly fighting his way out of the hesitancy. "This is a surprise. I certainly wasn't expecting to run into you here, or Yamada-san." No one seems to be willing to exchange pleasantries with him. "Why the fuck?" It's very unlike Hisashi to swear, especially in a tone like that. "Didn't you do anything?" Izuku feels like he's been left out of something very important. No matter that Izuku knows both Aizawa and Hisashi extremely well, he can't really tell what they're feeling right now beyond their anger. He only knows that they're somehow acquainted or familiar with the man at the door, who also happens to be one of the hostages from the villain attack. "How do you all know each other?" he asks, because there has to be some bad blood or at least some murky water between them to get this reaction out of both Aizawa and Hisashi. When an answer doesn't immediately come to him, he finds himself fisting his hand in the back of Hitoshi's shirt. "Zawa?" Yagi-san blanches a little at that, likely from the familiarity with which Izuku addresses Aizawa, but Izuku doesn't feel like analyzing the reaction. Aizawa blows out a slow breath and completely turns his back on Yagi-san to face Izuku, and looks like he's thinking about his words before he says, "Nezu hired him. He's going to be teaching at UA next year." Izuku blinks once, twice, tilts his head to the side, and slides his gaze past Aizawa to Yagi-san, still standing near the door. "You're going to teach at UA," Izuku murmurs, eyes narrowing. "Which means you're a pro hero." He knows every currently active combat hero that's in the Daylight Circuit, has them all stored in his mind, and most of them in his notebooks with a full 2-page spread analysis on them. He adds new heroes when they debut. There isn't a single one missing from his knowledge, even if putting them to paper is a slow and constant process, so who is this? Izuku's fully aware that hero personas and civilian appearances don't usually match up for safety and privacy and other reasons that are less important, but there's always something that gives it away. So Izuku looks. Frizzy and unkempt blonde hair, so yellow that it's almost gold, and those fringe pieces specifically. A little gel seems to be keeping them together, parted away from his face. His clothes are several sizes too big, hiding his frame completely and making him look skeletal. And those eyes, sunken and dark with irises so blue that it's impossible not to start making connections. "You're All Might." It's not a question, but his voice is full of disbelief, which is, in his opinion, warranted. The man in front of him doesn't look like he could win a fist fight against a toddler, let alone a swarm of villains. Somewhere in the back of his mind, far away from the slew of emotions he's trying to parse through. Izuku's already fitting this new revelation into his analysis of All Might's quirk. He wonders if it's like flexing a muscle, or if it's more ingrained than that. Yagi-san, and Izuku is going to continue to call him that until he's forcibly made to stop, because addressing any pro-hero by their hero name when they're out of costume feels weird. Nods once, slowly. His mouth is pressed into a tight line, but there's a certain sort of fire in his eyes, like he's intrigued by Izuku, not in a way that Izuku really likes. When Aizawa turns around, Yagi-san's eyes flick up to meet his, and he opens his mouth as if to say something, but seems to decide against it. Under Izuku's grip on his shirt, Hitoshi is shaking. Izuku doesn't realize it's anger until Hitoshi says something. "Why didn't you do anything?" he hisses, repeating the unanswered question that Hisashi had posed earlier. You're the fucking #1 hero, and you let yourself get taken hostage. You let Izuku get hurt. Hitoshi, hey. Izuku leans forward, wrapping both arms around his waist. It's okay. It already happened. He's not mad at Hitoshi for defending him. Hell, Izuku's glad to be cared about enough to be defended, but he doesn't see a point in being hostile. He's mad as fuck, too, but he's not going to start yelling. That's counterproductive to whatever the hell is going on here. It's not okay, Hitoshi says, adamantly not looking at Izuku. He does, however, set his hand over Izuku's and link their fingers together. Hitoshi's palm is warm against Izuku's knuckles, even through the bandages. Hizashi makes a noise of agreement. He's right. It's certainly not hero-like behavior. What do you have to say for yourself, Yagi-san? Well, Yagi-san looks at the four of them before his eyes settle on Hitoshi. This is quite a big secret. I don't suppose I could convince you to leave, young Shinso, Hitoshi says, almost spits. And not a chance in hell. Shinso stays. Aizawa agrees, folding his arms across his chest. If it's that big of a secret, then you can just leave. For a moment, Izuku thinks that Yagi-san will do just that, but there's a determination in his eyes, as well as a hunger, set deep into that electric blue when he flicks his gaze back to Izuku. After a moment of deliberation, Yagi-san reaches behind himself to close the door, and then, ignorant to the tension that spreads through the room, at that simple motion, he lifts up the hem of his shirt. There's a gruesome crater of a scar on his abdomen, as if his left side had been punched through and left cavernous. Izuku does his best not to wince, but he tightens his arms around Hitoshi and gets his hand squeezed in reassurance. This almost killed me, Yagi-san says, head tipped down to stare at his side. It seriously affected my respiratory system and many internal organs. Because of it, I can only maintain my All Might form for 3 hours per day. Any more than that, and I'm just speeding toward a finish line that I'm not ready to cross yet. He pauses to let his shirt fall back down. Izuku's too shocked to say anything. Then comes the memory of the realization he'd had almost 3 years ago, when he started in on the new notebooks Aizawa had bought for him, when he redid his analysis on All Might. This is why you've gotten slower. Yagi-san blinks owlishly at Izuku, but Aizawa slides him a small, prideful grin, and that's worth it. So, Hizashi says, still glaring at Yagi-san, though it's not as sharp now. You didn't help because you used up your 3 hours already? Yagi-san sighs like a man burdened. This injury is a huge secret, as is my other form. As much as I wanted to help, I couldn't risk the civilians finding out that I'm no longer strong enough to be the symbol of peace they look up to. Izuku's expression changes at those words. He'd been leaning toward sympathy, but that's gone now. His facial muscles slacken in shock, and then reshape into a frown. He doesn't pull it down all the way, doesn't bunch up his eyebrows into a scowl, but his body tenses as displeasure rolls through him. Amahaki responds to his emotions the only way it can, by swirling harshly through his body and adding weight to key areas, joints, chest, spine, as it readies for a fight. So Yagi-san hadn't helped, not because he was afraid of pushing the limits of his health, but because he's keeping secrets. And yes, Izuku can acknowledge that those secrets are expensive. He knows firsthand the debt of his own secret spilling out into the world would be paid with his own life or his freedom. But Izuku still managed to help. Yagi-san, supposedly still All Might, froze up when he had to think of a solution that didn't involve his quirk. Fuck, how many heroes are like this? How many heroes became helpless as soon as the option to use their quirk is taken away from them? Izuku quickly thinks back through the research he's done. Years of analysis at both the facility and since living with Aizawa. Never once has he seen a video of a pro hero losing their quirk, but more times than he can count, he's watched fights where heroes used their quirks in a setting that actively worked against them, or against villains who had quirks to perfectly counter them, and Izuku knows for a fact that one of the many reasons for Aizawa's success as an underground hero is that once villains lose access to their quirk, they suddenly forget how to fight. Sometimes, though it's quite rare, Izuku is thankful that he was born quirkless, that he still has to wrestle with his quirk every day to do what he says his mind do. It's hard. Fuck, it's hard. It's been an uphill battle to train his body and his mind to the point that he can stand on the same playing field as other hero hopefuls. But this is definitely one of those times that Izuku is glad to have suffered through everything he has. The struggle has kept his eyes open, and it allows him to see the absolute bullshit happening in front of him. Izuku forces his features to smooth out, but when he smiles, it's nothing more than a baring of teeth that doesn't reach his eyes. I'm glad I was there to help then. God knows how many people could have been hurt if Izuku hadn't been there, the little girl especially, who only made it safely back to her father's arms because Izuku traded places with her. And that's not Izuku letting the situation swing past him as a wild success. It wasn't, and he fucked up multiple times, and he nearly died. Then he made his dads and Hitoshi upset, and that alone is going to hang off of him like a cloud for the foreseeable future. But in this one thing, in this one circumstance, he's nearly positive that the end results would have been much worse if he had happened to walk into a different shop to look for gifts. Clearly the pro-hero who had been present wasn't going to try and get that little girl out of harm's way. Yagi-san looks weary, and he fucking should. His brows pull in and down, and his mouth twists into a knot. My boy, you seem disappointed. Don't call me that. Izuku's voice is hard and unyielding for a moment before it settles out into something smoother. And I'll get over it, he promises, which, for whatever reason, startles a laugh out of Hitoshi. Izuku blinks and turns his head to look at his dad, wondering where he found humor in the tension coating the air. He's glad for it, regardless. Sorry. Hitoshi holds up his hands as he fights back another round of laughter, this one probably prompted by the raised eyebrows Aizawa gives him. This is just... He sweeps his arm out to the room, still a little breathless and wiping tears from his eyes. Yagi-san, what are you doing here? The hunched blonde skeleton. No, that's not fair. Izuku shakes himself mentally and pushes down on the little pleasure of amahaki creeping up his spine to his shoulders. Yagi-san cups the back of his neck and looks at the floor. I'm, not sure how to start this discussion, honestly. Aizawa stiffens suddenly, drawing Izuku's eyes to him. Something about his stance makes him seem like he's alert for danger, which makes Izuku tense up in turn. He'd heard something in Yagi-san's voice, too, something that spelled out, beware, beware, beware. Is this going to cause trouble for Izuku? What? Yagi-san brings his head up, blinking those sunken blue eyes to focus on Aizawa, who does not repeat himself. After swallowing thickly, Yagi-san decides to answer. My request definitely comes with some dangers, but I feel confident from what I saw today that your student... Poor word choice. He is not just my student, Aizawa says, cleanly cutting off Yagi-san before he has a chance to finish his thought. Izuku is my son, and I will not allow you or anyone else to willingly put him in danger until he's ready to handle it, and I don't care if you think he's ready or not. He's a teenager, for fuck's sake. Because he cares, because he knows Izuku better than anyone. Aizawa does not say Izuku is 15. I am already exercising every bit of my self-restraint to not physically get violent with you for not stepping in during a villain attack, but I'm cutting this discussion off before it starts. Hitoshi, do you have any complaints? Hitoshi's response is immediate. None. As if expecting that answer, Aizawa doesn't hesitate before continuing. Izuku, is this all right with you? He turns to look at Izuku, and Izuku manages to hold his gaze, but honestly, he's a bit too emotional to make his throat work. This whole day had been a lot. Emotionally taxing and physically painful, and to watch Aizawa thoroughly dress down the #1 pro-hero because he cares about Izuku's safety and well-being more than what some stupid popularity contest says is really just too much. Izuku knows that Aizawa cares about him, has been given zero evidence to the contrary in nearly 3 years, but it still feels so novel to be shown that care so openly. Izuku's throat tightens, burns. Amahaki moves strangely in his chest, or maybe that's just the urge to start crying again. Aizawa's expression softens, and it's so slight that Izuku doubts anyone aside from himself and Hitoshi would ever be able to notice. Izuku. This is the tone Aizawa reserves for when Izuku is sick, or for when he does something kind unexpectedly. It's soft, gentle, caring, parental. Oh, he's definitely going to cry about this, and probably soon, but for now he swallows his emotions and pushes out a tight nod. I've got enough of my own troubles. He sets his chin on Hitoshi's shoulder and sighs, slightly watery eyes moving back to Yagi-san. I'm sure that whatever your request is would have been an honor to be offered, but I can't help you. Yagi-san stands in front of the door, with his mouth still slightly open from when Aizawa had cut him off, as if he just can't quite believe that he's been shut down by nearly everyone in the room before he even finished his request. He doesn't look angry, just shocked, like he's never been denied anything before in his life, and Izuku doesn't doubt that. Who would ever deny the #1 pro-hero? As All Might, he's so open and friendly and eager to help that Izuku thinks it must be at least partly due to Yagi-san's natural personality, that he just has an innate draw that lures people in. It's possible that Izuku could have eventually been swayed if Yagi-san had found him alone and had talked to him without his dad's or Hitoshi present, but really, who knows? Izuku never even got to hear what Yagi-san was going to ask him. It's better this way. He's sure of it. Eventually, Yagi-san shakes his head, but there's a small, almost embarrassed smile on his face that at least seems sincere. All right. He laughs lightly, tension easing from his shoulders. I completely understand. Izuku knows he doesn't, because he can't, because he doesn't know about Amahaki. He must be rather put out, too, but he doesn't look like he's fumbling despite his stuttered attempts at getting them to this point. Aizawa-san, Yamada-san, I apologize for intruding. Young Aizawa, young Shinso. Yagi-san smiles, and this time it's an All Might smile. I'll see you both at UA next year. He bows briefly and then disappears from the room, closing the door behind him. After a few seconds of silence, Aizawa lets out a harsh breath, which resets the whole room. Izuku slumps forward into Hitoshi, and Hitoshi likewise slumps backward into Izuku. Hisashi pushes his hand through his hair and paces a single tight circle before finally relaxing. That idiot can't even keep his own secrets, Aizawa says. Izuku, please, for the love of God, don't tell him about Amahaki. Okay. Izuku's still a little dazed by the whole exchange. What is he teaching at UA? Fundamental heroics, Hisashi answers while Aizawa approaches the bed and crouches down to reach under it. Although Nezu hasn't decided to share why he hired someone without any teaching experience or degrees. Izuku hums in thought, tipping his head to the side so he can nuzzle into Hitoshi's neck. He's warm and comfortable, and he likes the way Hitoshi's breath catches a little when Izuku's nose brushes his skin. Nezu is always doing something unexpected, he says. More than once, when Izuku was meant to be studying under Nezu's eye, he'd been instead sent off by the principal to crawl through ventilation ducts and complete small espionage missions, leave a note on Kon-sensei's podium, steal a red pen from Snipe-sensei, bring a platter of cookies from the kitchens without being seen by lunch rush. No rhyme or reason in Izuku's mind, but he also knows that nothing Nezu does is without intention. Aizawa straightens up and plops his black go bag onto the bed beside Izuku. Clothes, he explains when Izuku tilts his head at him. Come on, let's get you home. I'll go fill out the paperwork, Hisashi offers, coming over to ruffle Izuku's hair before slipping out of the room. Sleepy, Izuku hums, burrowing closer to Hitoshi, who enables him further by tightening his hold on Izuku's hand and easily supporting his weight. Aizawa's hand slides into Izuku's hair. I know, but unless you want me to carry you out in a hospital gown with your bare butt on full display, you're going to have to get up and put on some clothes. Izuku groans in protest, but he forces himself to sit up straight and relaxes hold on Hitoshi's waist. Hitoshi slides off the bed, but stays close as Izuku takes a pair of sweatpants from Aizawa and pulls them on. Can Hitoshi come with? Izuku asks once he has his shoes on, too. Hitoshi immediately takes Izuku's hand, threading their fingers together. I already asked my parents, and they said I can stay the night. Nothing for it, then. Aizawa sighs, though he doesn't sound put upon at all. Hisashi returns to the room a few minutes later with the nurse trailing behind him. She takes the needle out of Izuku's arm and the heart rate monitor off of his finger. While she turns away to give Aizawa and Hisashi instructions on pain regulation, Izuku takes off his hospital gown and pulls on the shirt that Aizawa had laid on top of the bag. Toshi, he murmurs, low enough so that it's just for them. I'm sorry for scaring you. Hitoshi, lovely, wonderful, caring Hitoshi, puts his hands on Izuku's cheeks, and after a brief hesitation, kisses his forehead. It's not your fault, but fuck off if you think that I'm ever going to let you go anywhere by yourself again. You attract trouble wherever you go. Izuku snorts and then bursts into laughter. He wants to say that's fair. Wants to say that he'll spoil all of Hitoshi's future birthday and Christmas presents if it means his eternal company. Wants to say he loves him so much he thinks he'll burst with it. But after he gets his breath back, all he does is give a wicked little smile and say, It's a good thing we'll be in the same class next year then, so you keep an eye on me. There's nowhere else I'd rather be. All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 24, Swallow the Stars. Chapter 25 will be next, which will kick up the UA arc, which will be the third part to this fic. I hope you guys are still enjoying. Let me know your thoughts and reactions, and as always, thank you so much for listening.